Black people did not cause these riots. Black people did not cause themselves to be in North America. There were no black sailors purchasing ships, engaging in the Atlantic slave trade. There were no black people sailing over in submarines or flying in aircraft, walking on water. Black people didn't cause themselves to be in America. Those were merchants. Merchants took black people from Africa to America, where they could sell them because they were cheaper than actually having to pay people a decent wage, so that these wealthy plantation owners who founded America, the merchants who fought and instigated the American Revolution, they wouldn't have to pay people a living wage, just house them and feed them. Race relations obviously changed in the country over time due to the abolition movement. Black people did not cause the abolition movement. Black people did not cause the abolition movement. The abolition movement was first and foremost promoted by two factors that were changes in technology and economic conditions. And you could say alongside that, regional differences, regional conflict, and blending into that, religious conflict. The abolitionists were Northerners who wanted to advance their technology into the South, and they saw slavery as an impediment to that. The Northern industrialists wanted to buy up land. They wanted to buy up property. They wanted to invest their machines in factories. They wanted to build in the South, but they were prevented because you had these big plantation owners who owned everything, and they refused. Much in the same way that Western Europe was industrializing, Eastern Europe, Russia refused because they still had serfdom. They had cheap labor. They weren't open to capitalism. And so much as people in Western Europe instigated regime change in Russia because it was too backward, it was not open to capitalism, in the South versus the North conflict, you had industrialists who wanted to destroy slavery as much as people wanted to destroy serfdom because it was an opponent to the free movement of capital, because it was a stagnant aristocratic system. It was not mercantile enough. That is what instigated the Civil War, alongside the religious aspect, the Quakers, the Shakers, Episcopalians of various stripes. Religious movements in the North were very powerful in abolitionism, but it wasn't black people who caused the abolition movement. It wasn't black people who started the Civil War. Much in the same way that black people were used and abused as pawns during the Atlantic slave trade, they were also viewed as a pawn or a thing to fight over in the Civil War. And many of them did fight in that Civil War, but they did not cause that Civil War. John Brown and his little revolt. There were black participants in that revolt, but they did not cause that revolt. And perhaps you could say some of them, Frederick Douglass, participated, but they did not cause the event. When we look at these historical events that led us to the present day, the Atlantic slave trade, the Civil War, that led us to where we are now, where America is on fire, black people did not cause that. But you could say that's ancient history. You could say that was a long time ago and it doesn't matter and it's irrelevant. What we need to focus is on more recent history. Why do people riot? Is it spontaneous? Is it natural? Is it natural for people to riot, or do people riot because they think they should? Or because they feel they have permission? Or because they have a moral crusade? Or because they're angry at a system? None of that is accidental. None of that is spontaneous. All of that is the result of education, of religion, of narrative, of mythology. Where does all of that come from? It doesn't come from the black community, because the last time I checked, the people writing the textbooks were not black. The people writing the history of America, which has created all this resentment, were not black. I don't know what your curriculum was like, but when I was in 3rd grade, I was taught that white people genocided the Native Americans. Later on, I was taught about slavery. But this was not accidental. It was not that my 3rd grade teacher was some fanatic or that she was some off the reservation, crazy, lunatic, fringe teacher. She was following the curriculum. She was following the textbook, as every elementary school and middle school and high school teacher does, all the way up through college and now graduate school. The sociologists and the anthropologists, they're basically all following the same narrative. And it's one that promotes racial resentment. This is not the mythology of historical America. Historical America did not teach every single boy and girl from age 9, and in some cases even earlier now, although at that age it's kind of hard to inculcate people with what is fundamentally a religious narrative. It is about morality, it is about history, it is about sacred events, it is about cataclysms and apocalypse. This is all the Bible is about. All the Bible is about genocides and battles and kings and oppressed peoples and enslavement. That's what the Bible is about. So when we present historical facts, even if we ourselves feel that we are doing so objectively, we are never doing so unemotionally. There is always a hidden and implicit morality and impulse and impellation behind every presentation of so-called objective fact. I do that as much as any school teacher. Whenever there is a retelling of history, it is always implicitly, whether conscious or not, telling people how they should feel and how they should act. Following the end of slavery in America, there was mass segregation. There was segregation in the South as well as segregation in the North. There were a lot of race riots. There was a lot of racial tension. And for a while, things just kind of went on between, say, the creation of the NAACP and the end of slavery. During that period, maybe a 60-year period or so, 50-year period, from the 19th to the 20th century, things basically just went on. New York City was a white majority city. Chicago, Detroit were white majority cities. These cities did not yet have, from World War I, this mass movement of people and capital, this industrial mini revolution in America that we got from World War I. That didn't happen yet. And people, white or black, basically stayed in their place. They stayed where they were born. They grew up in a town and they stayed in that town. And maybe you moved to a local city. But things basically stagnated. And the school books were not filled with stories of how the white people genocided the Native Americans or how the white people mistreated the slaves. The history books weren't filled with that presentation. They were filled with a different presentation. The change in presentation that came in America, this mythological change, not meaning that it went from falsehood to falsehood or truth to falsehood or falsehood to truth, but that there was a change in what was emphasized and what was important. Right? What was important back then was Plymouth Rock and the Pilgrims and the Puritans and the industrialization of America and maybe the Civil War. And so there were things that were important and things that were taught and things that were true. It wasn't that the facts being taught in school were false. They weren't saying, and America was founded by George Washington and he was 9 feet tall and weighed 400 pounds. They weren't just spreading falsehoods, but they were selectively presenting a history, specifically in mind to create a national identity for the American people, to say, this is who we are, this is our mythology, this is where we come from, these are our founding fathers. Very similar to how in the Christian New Testament, there is this presentation that Christians are the descendants of Abraham through Christianity, that they are the spiritual descendants. In the same way, a mythology was created that said Americans are the spiritual descendants of George Washington and Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and Abraham Lincoln and all these early presidents. And there was a mythology that was created. And there was a lot of history to be taught, and there were a lot of facts and dates to be memorized, and there were a lot of days of celebration and days of remembrance. Remember the Alamo. And so American history was very presented in a rich and complex way, but there was still a narrative to it. That narrative changed. Who changed that narrative? It was not black people. Black people did not change the history books. They did not create public schooling in America. Black people didn't advance the concept of public schooling. Black people didn't advance the concept of a public education. Black people did not change the ideology of America. The United States entry into World War I, which was perpetrated by Woodrow Wilson and his cohort, and the type of people he put on the Supreme Court and surrounded himself with, and the type of people who bankrolled him and lobbied for him. That was a significant period in America, and none of that was instigated by black people. The big financial power in America, the way that America is economically organized, black people had no input into that. Black people had no input into the creation of the Federal Reserve. They didn't help Andrew Jackson dismantle it, and they didn't help Wilson put it back up again. All of the changes that happened during the Roaring 20s, the 1920s, the rise of Hollywood. Black people didn't create Hollywood. Hollywood movies. Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. Avatar. These movies that have very clear political implications and very clear political messages, black people didn't create those. They didn't create the entertainment industry. And sure, we give credit where credit is due. I'm not going to say black people didn't accomplish anything. I'm not going to say that they didn't do anything. They clearly put in a lot of agricultural work into America during the period of slavery. They clearly worked in factories in this migration to the north. They clearly had influence, if not just entirely created the genre of jazz music and of blues, and then Motown influencing the development of rock and roll, getting into R&B, hip-hop, rap. Black people have created a lot of art. So the narrative here I want to make clear is not that black people haven't created anything, or that black people don't have the potentiality to be creative in music, in dance, in the black churches, black-led churches, creating their own hymns, creating their own style of dress, creating their own mythologies, Egyptology, Pan-Africanism, Marcus Garvey. So the narrative here that I'm pushing isn't that black people never did anything, or they never thought thoughts, or they never sang, they never produced art, they didn't have a culture, that they didn't get married, that they weren't Christian, because they were all of those things, and they did have societies, and they did have people who were doctors and who were lawyers. They did have a black middle class and a black upper class. And they did have black people who were influential in their own communities. But the main point is that these monumental racial changes that we see in America, going from slavery, through civil rights, through the creation of Hollywood, through that diverse message that's put on the Statue of Liberty. The poem on the Statue of Liberty was not written by black people. The concept of anarchism was not invented by black people. Antifa was not invented by black people. Communism is not a movement invented by black people. Karl Marx wasn't black. Neither was Friedrich Engels or Wilhelm Weitling. Black people didn't invent the far left. Black people did not undermine and deconstruct Christianity. Black people didn't say God is dead. Black people did not cause the French Revolution, if we're going to go that deep with it. Black people didn't start Freemasonry. Black people did not create Protestantism. How far do we have to go back? Talk about all these huge monumental changes that have brought us to where we are today. I don't think black people caused any of those things. It's not an insult. It's not a dig. I'm not angry. I'm not mad. The reason why I'm saying this, and we can keep going on and on and on through the 20th century and talk about everything that's gone on, but the fact is, black people have participated in Western civilization, and America especially, since the Atlantic slave trade. They've participated, and they've worked hard, and they've built up the fields, and they've built up the factories, and they've contributed. You can't deny that. They've contributed. But were they the architects of civilization? Were they the ones who brought us to where we are today? All of the changes that we've seen in the way that we think, in the way that we pray, in the way that we see the world. I won't say that jazz music and other contributions, artistic contributions, haven't changed some of the way that maybe we perceive the world. The invention of musical genre is an interesting subject that in some ways jazz reflects the times in which it was invented and then sort of creates a feedback loop that enhances the feeling of that particular time. And we could go into a whole discussion of jazz music. I don't fundamentally think that jazz music has brought us to where we are today. But even if we were to go that far, even if we were to blame all of America's problems on jazz music, who propagated jazz music? Was it black people who built the radio towers? Was it black people who established the FCC under FDR? Was it black people who created the Telecommunications Act? Was it black people who decided what media got promoted and what didn't? When you look at the invention of the Hollywood industry in America, you look at people like Al Jolson, who not only wore blackface, but was also a huge activist for the black community. He wore blackface in an attempt, from his words and his perspective, to make the black community seem friendly, to make them seem familiar to white audiences. That was his intention. Now, of course, today we decry that as racist and offensive. But he was a huge activist for the black community. So when you ask, how do we get from a country in which we just can't imagine the kind of state that we're in today? If we look back, we have to ask, how did we get here? Because it almost seems impossible. You have to look at people like Al Jolson as the people who led the effort to change race relations in this country, to create narratives of racial resentment. How did we go from a country which was an undeniably supremacist country? No one can deny that. I mean, I guess there's Dinesh D'Souza, but everyone sees him as a hack. Anyone who has half a brain cell knows that Dinesh D'Souza is peddling nonsense. We went from a country that was a supremacist country, that was in many ways a stable country. In many ways it was a country in which a number of people were enslaved. But that was the country that we had. How did we go through these radical changes? Without even coming to the moral question, as I said before, every presentation has an underlying moral message. But let's even try, or at least attempt for a moment, to say, regardless of whether you think it was good or bad, America has undergone some fundamental changes. Whether you think the past was better, make America great again, whether you have a nostalgic feeling of the golden age of the American past in the 1950s and you think that was perfect, it should have just stayed that way forever, or whether you think that past was terrible and evil and should be totally destroyed and we should go into the future and be totally different. Whatever side of the narrative you fall on, everyone has to agree we've radically changed. We are not the same country. We're not the same nation we were 100 years ago, 50 years ago. We've radically changed. How did that happen? It wasn't black people who caused that change. Black people have participated in that change. They've marched for that change. They've lived for that change. They've died for that change. But they didn't orchestrate the change. They were not the architects of that change. They didn't promulgate the ideology for that change. They did not finance that change. The changes that we can see happening through characters like Al Jolson, the invention of the Hollywood industry, the communist ideology, the Trotskyite ideology specifically, that becomes very prevalent in America, the Communist Party, which funds Martin Luther King, the NAACP, which was not founded by black people. The NAACP, the original OG black civil rights organization, was not founded by black people. Black people didn't cause it. They participated in it. They followed it. They listened to it. They listened to its narratives. They bought into it. They marched for it, but they didn't invent it. They were not the catalyst of change. There's a difference between a man who fills his car up with dynamite and parks it next to a building. There's a difference between that man and the man or the crowd of people who blow it up. There's a difference between the man who supplies the guns to the army and the soldiers who shoot. There's a difference between the grunts and the privates on the ground and the men on the front lines and the generals. There's a difference between the masses of the people who do not declare war and the political leadership and the financial leadership of the country that do declare war. There's a fundamental difference there. And all of this anti-black ideology and hatred that calls itself HBD and drones on endlessly about Jared Taylor and the color of crime and the FST values and talks about cranial capacity and the mirror test and the IQ scores and the bell curve, and we could go on and on and on. People have spent their whole lives with the Council of Conservative Citizens and American Renaissance and the Republican Party and Sean Hannity and Hal Turner and Bill O'Reilly. And all of these conservative figures have made it a career of directing people's hatred and anger and frustration and resentment toward black people. Because they point to this idea, it would be as if Mayor Frey in Minneapolis said, we're going to let all the prisoners out of prison. Right? What do you think would happen? I mean, those prisoners would probably commit crimes, right? What would be the cause of those crimes? Would you say, it was the criminals? We have to fight these criminals. We have to hold these criminals responsible for these crimes. Well, in some sense. But you can lock them all up as much as you want, but if Mayor Frey keeps letting them loose, well, doesn't matter how many you lock up. And at that point, If someone says to you, don't blame Mayor Frey, it's all these criminals. If someone says that, they're not just lying. They're not just deceiving. They're on the side of Mayor Frey. They're attacking you by proxy. They're telling you to focus on the symptoms and not the causes. Because Mayor Frey is the one who keeps letting them out of prison. And you can fight them all day. You can jump out of your car with a crossbow. I don't care. If you never address the guy who's letting them out of prison, you're never going to get anywhere. And so the people like Jared Taylor and Bill O'Reilly and Sean Hannity and the Council of Conservative Citizens and the HBD people, and sometimes they'll describe themselves as racists or racialists or pro-white people or whatever they call themselves, but if they're pushing this narrative that we need to focus on black criminality and black violence and black on white crime, I don't care about black on white crime. I don't care. I don't care how many blacks rape whites. I don't care how many blacks kill whites. I don't care how many robberies they do or whatever. Because that is a symptom. And if you waste your time on symptoms, nothing will get done. You'll get a few confused people shouting "All lives matter" with a crossbow, standing in the middle of a protest surrounded by thousands of people. That's what you get. You get people, scared, frightened people, plowing their car through a crowd of protesters. That's what you get. And you know what the result of those kind of actions are? We don't get closer to any kind of solution from those kinds of actions. What we now have are more fuel for the fire. Every time we get a car crashing into protesters, every time we get a dude with a crossbow, every time we get one of these incidents, it's just more fuel for the fire. This religious mania, which is spreading over the country. It is a religion. We have to understand the battle is not racial, it is religious. Black people didn't cause this. Black people are swept up in this. They are caught up in this, but they did not cause this. What is happening today, America is on fire, not because black people created the conditions to bring us to this point, but because they are being swept up, because they have bought into this idea that the narrative of racial resentment is their religion. And it's not just them who have been caught up in it, it's plenty of white people, Asian people, Hispanic people, people of all races are caught up in this narrative of racial resentment, which, by the way, never targets rich white people. Whether we're talking about Brazil or South Africa or in California, the rich white people live in gated communities. And they're not affected by this narrative of racial resentment. So we can understand why they would promote it, right? It's a way of monopolizing power. If you can get the black and brown people to get caught up in this religion of racial resentment, then you can have them fighting the working class and middle class white people who otherwise would present a challenge to the monopolization of power. That's religious. That's not about our DNA. That's not about our genetics. Black people do not have a hating white people gene. We know that because that's not how America was prior to the Civil War. Black people were not rioting all the time prior to the Civil War. They weren't even rioting all the time after the Civil War. And yes, there were racial riots in America. But they really weren't at the scale that we see today, where every single American city is on fire. That wasn't happening. Yeah, there would be local incidents where black would be killed by white would be killed by black. You know, a posse of 20 gets together, a posse of 100 gets together. All of a sudden, you got a brawl in the streets with thousands of people. That did happen prior to civil rights. It wasn't all flowers and roses. It wasn't a perfect situation. But the narratives and the religion of racial resentment that we have today is not something that's embedded in the DNA or genetic code of black and brown people in America. It's not something they were born with. They were not born hating white people. They were not born hating white people. It is not in their blood to hate white people. It is something they have been taught. And there are people who are responsible for teaching them that religion of racial resentment. And those people are identifiable. We can look at history, and the people who created the religion of racial resentment do not have black and brown skin. That's not how they look. That's not how they identify. We can look back in history and ask the deep questions of how we got here, and we are really not going to find a lot of black and brown faces creating this religion of racial resentment that's brought us to the present day. We're just not going to find them. We're not going to find them in the Trotskyites, in the American Communist Party. We're not going to find them in the creators of Hollywood. We're not going to find them in Al Jolson. We're not going to find them in FDR. We're not going to find them in Eisenhower. Eisenhower wasn't a black man. When he ordered the National Guard or the military at the point of a bayonet to desegregate the American schools, he wasn't a black or brown person. The Civil Rights Bill, maybe it had support from all of these organizations because by that time, the religion had really become quite fanatical, especially after World War II. The instruction of Lyndon Johnson, the Civil Rights Act, he wasn't black or brown. All of the laws that were passed, affirmative action, the Great Society, the welfare state, the destruction of the black church, the destruction of the black family. Black people didn't cause that. Black people were they were doing the best that they could with what they had in forming black churches and forming black families. They were trying their best. And you know what? They were doing pretty good. If you compare them to how white people are doing today even, they were doing pretty good. Their church institutions were pretty robust. Their communities were pretty strong. Their families and their marriages were healthy. And they had all those things. And the people who destroyed those things and got them hooked on crack cocaine and put weed in their community to make them lazier, to make them hedonistic, the people who pushed all of these things were not black and brown. The people who controlled the FBI and the CIA were not black and brown. And ultimately, I'm starting to question, when we even look at those race riots that happened in the 1960s and the civil rights, and you look at a man like J. Edgar Hoover and what he was up to with Martin Luther King and all the just weird, crazy stuff that was going on at that time. I mean, we know Martin Luther King was a plagiarist. We know that people wrote his speeches for him, and the only thing he did is he read the speech, he memorized it, he read it, he walked down the street, he allowed himself to be put in handcuffs, and then he stood in a jail and, repeat that several cycles, and now he's a hero. We know that certainly these Trotskyist organizations were pulling the strings, but you also have to wonder things like the Vietnam War and the Vietnam War protests. When World War II went on, anyone who is a pacifist was put under arrest. This is something that is not taught to you about World War II. We don't talk about how freedom of speech was suspended during World War II. But if you were a person during World War II who said something, you didn't have to be a pacifist. You didn't have to be against the war. But if you said something that the government disapproved of, they shut you down. They shut down your radio. It doesn't matter if you have millions of listeners. They shut you down. And in many cases, they imprisoned you. They silenced you. That's what the government, the American government, does during war. It wasn't the first time that happened. We have the Alien and Sedition Acts back from the 18th century, right from the beginning. When the American government gets serious about something, it suspends freedom of speech. They didn't do that during the Vietnam War, which is highly suspicious to me. Every important war that America ever has, they always suspend free speech. They didn't do it during the Vietnam War. It seems to me that when you look at the background of what they were doing with LSD and experimenting on people and the hippie movement and their attempt to create a safe form of communism, that is a communism that would actually ultimately be compatible with capitalism, we see how that's played out in China, where China is one of the greatest assets of global capitalism. You know, it's the foundry of global capitalism. So they've neutered communism and made it into something that's acceptable and compatible with capitalism. They've done that in China during the Sino-Soviet split with Nixon. And I think they did it internally within America. I think they said, you know, this communism is dangerous. Stalinism, you know, it's dangerous. It's problematic. And we need to create a safe version of communism. It's going to be socially radical and economically capitalist. And that's what you saw under people like Martin Luther King and afterwards. So I do have to question the extent to which, I mean, we could even put all that crazy stuff aside and we could say that all the race riots after the 1960s were just a logical conclusion of a religious framework that black people had been indoctrinated into, which was not created by black people. We could even say that. When you look at the people who have been down to the county level, we're talking about the county school board, the state education department, the federal department of education, the people who lead these departments, who make the decisions, who decide the curriculum, who decide the textbooks, most of them are not black. The people who decide the funding to the public schools, what gets funded. The people who decide whether the street is going to be named Martin Luther King Street, the people who build the museums and the statues, people who make these fundamental decisions, most of the time, they're not black. So whether we're talking about the religious dimension or we're talking about the educational dimension, and ultimately understanding that all these things are controlled by a financial dimension, that when we talk about who gets elected, it's who's got the money to get elected, because it costs a lot of money to get elected. Who's got the money to get elected? The party machine. Well, where does the party machine get its money? From the donors. Who are the donors? The rich. Those who are connected with the financial system, not those who are producing things, but those who are skimming 1% interest. Those who are issuing the loans, those who are printing the currency, those who are doing insider trading. You know, we've just had an economic recession. You look at Jeff Bezos and his friends, and they dumped all their stocks. So what they did is they sold the stocks when the price was high, and now they're going to buy them back when the price is low. And they're going to instantly earn money. Over the course of a couple months, they're earning billions of dollars. Their wealth has increased an average of 15%, not doing any productive work. So those are the people who own the political parties, who therefore own the politicians, who institute all these appointments, who own the media, the big broadcasting, CNN, Fox News, and then you have your own little indie. You've got Vice News, you've got YouTube. YouTube is basically a news organization. Twitter, right? Who owns these corporations? Well, they're publicly traded. So who's on the board of directors? Who owns all the shares? So who ultimately makes the decisions? Because it's not random. YouTube doesn't just make decisions randomly. It makes decisions according to what the board of directors decide. And the board of directors aren't just random workers at YouTube. They're people who have the money to buy those positions, who have all the stocks. So ultimately, we can lay blame, if we want to blame somebody for all the radical social changes that have happened in America, and right now the big focus is these race riots, which I don't think is very important in the grand scheme of things. I'm talking about it because it's in the news. And frankly, it's agitating me. It's agitating everybody to see white people getting beaten up, and we don't know if these people are dead. We don't know. When I see a video, and by the way, the people beating them up are not all black. There's plenty of white people doing the beating as well. And I'm also seeing police brutality. I'm also seeing police just driving into crowds and shoving people, weak old people, small women, just shoving them on the ground. So it's not that I have sympathy for the cops. You know, I have sympathy for individual cops who got that job because they thought it would be the right thing to do, or they were just trying to make a decent living, and now they're watching this chaos going on and they don't know what to do, and it's a crazy situation. I have sympathy with individual cops, but I don't have sympathy for the cops as an institution. The cops as an institution are part of this conservative complex that they basically prevent the system from receiving any pushback for any of its bad decisions, or any of its decisions that harm the people of the country, the people who are actually producing the things that we all need to live our lives. They're insulated, right? Politicians are insulated from that because you've got a force known as the police, who make any kind of resistance impossible. The reason why we're having riots, and I guess we're kind of getting up to the present day. I mean, we could document every single event that's ever happened. You know, we could talk about Sean King and Rachel Dolezal. We could talk about George Soros. We could talk about Media Matters. We could talk about Barack Obama. Who was Barack Obama and who put him in that position as a figurehead? And we could endlessly, I mean, there's so much to go into. Right? But if we just fast forward to the present day, why are these riots happening? They're not happening because of black people. They're happening because the media, in much the same ways they did with Trayvon Martin, in much the same way they did with Michael Brown, in much the same way they've done time and time again, when a Daniel Shaver gets brutally shot by police for no reason at all, that is ignored. And because who would care anyway? Frankly, I'm not going to burn down a Target over Daniel Shaver. I'm not going to do it. It's not in me. I don't think it would make anything better. But there's no, to bring the point further, there's no religious fervor that wants to defend Daniel Shaver from police brutality. Because Daniel Shaver is a dead white man. And that doesn't matter. It doesn't fit in with the religious narrative, right? If you're talking about Puritan colonial America and a woman is, you know, up to no good and she's casting spells and she's promiscuous or whatever she's doing that people are going to accuse her of witchcraft, she fits into a certain narrative, and thus there is a frenzy around her. There's a mob that comes to kill her. But if a man maybe does some similar things, the man is not, that doesn't arouse it doesn't arouse a mob. Maybe he goes to jail or whatever. Maybe there's a problem with what he's doing. But he's not a witch, right? So in a sense, when we could talk about so many different examples of when a victim class is established in a religious narrative, that creates a religious frenzy, right? So let's say you have a group of people known as priests, and a priest is murdered. That creates a religious frenzy. Now their mob forms to, find the murderer. Whereas if just some regular Joe is murdered, well, it's still a problem. The police go after him or whatever. But it doesn't create that religious frenzy, right? So we've got this religious frenzy today. And the reason we've got here is because of a very long history of creating religious narratives. We didn't get here overnight. Indoctrination doesn't happen in the course of a day. It happens generation after generation of religious indoctrination. This is fundamentally a religious phenomenon. It's not a phenomenon of DNA or genetics. Furthermore, it's not just that there is an overpowering fanaticism in the religion of racial resentment in America, but it's also logistic. It's not just the fact that it exists, but that the media is tapping into it. And the media is agitating. It's holding up this totem, this image of a police officer kneeling on this guy's neck, which is horrifying. But so is the video of Daniel Shaver being killed. That's also horrifying. And there are many horrifying videos on the internet, but most of them don't cause America to ignite in 100 different riots across the country. This is religious. This is not objective. This is not factual. This is religious. So the media has purposely caused that. The media is not controlled by black people. The media is at fault. The media is responsible. The media is not controlled by black people. And therefore, black people did not cause this. They participated in it. They didn't cause it. But furthermore, after the media instigated these riots, they started small, and they started in Minneapolis. And what was the response from Mayor Frey? The response from Mayor Frey was to let them go on. Mayor Frey did not crack down. Mayor Frey did not disavow. Mayor Frey did not denounce. Mayor Frey encouraged. Mayor Frey instigated. Mayor Frey agitated. Mayor Frey said, "You are in the right," and he gave a religious speech. Mayor Frey is a priest. You listen to what Mayor Frey had to say? Mayor Frey said, "You're so in the right, and this is so terrible, and your wrath is just." He got up there like a preacher. And he said, "We have to destroy white supremacy." And that's the speech he gave, and he told the police to stand down. And it seems institutionally like the police have been time and time again doing this practice where they move in, they agitate the protesters, they throw the tear gas, they spray the pepper spray, they push people on the floor, they wrestle with people, they arrest people, they drive cars into crowds, and then they retreat, and then they back up, and then they let the looting begin, and the arson begin. So they go in, they agitate the population, and then they let the population just run wild. There is a way to stop a riot. It's been done time and time again. If you don't believe me, look back at the LA riots, 1992. George H.W. Bush, the man who basically coined the term New World Order in the popular imagination, so not an endorsement of him, but just showing logistically, when you get tough on a riot, the riot disappears. When you have National Guardsmen and military men going in with the explicit purpose to stop the riot, and you have the political will and the decision and instruction to do it, it stops. The masses of people do not have the ability to stand up against an organized, militarized force. If that force truly has a mission and the intention from the top down is to stop the riot, rioters don't have a choice. They don't have the ability to resist. Just as peasants in the Middle Ages could not resist knights on horseback, rioters in 2020 can't resist the police and the military if they roll in with a strong intention to put the riots down. They just can't. When you look at Kent State back in the 60s, of course, students were shot. And that's bad. And that's not something that's good. But it's saying that fundamentally the system doesn't want the riots to stop because the riots are part of the system. And when I say the system, I'm talking about the financial system, and I'm talking about the media system, and I'm talking about even the police themselves. Because in all these cases, even though police on the ground, I'm watching them getting beat up by protesters. And again, whatever you think about the police as an institution, you have to wonder in some of the cases, it's like they didn't sign up for this. They signed up to protect their community. Maybe they signed up for a power trip. I don't know what their motivations were. But they didn't sign up for this. They didn't sign up to be put on a police line and get beaten up by protesters. Not all of them, okay? Maybe some of them, but this is ridiculous. The problem is is that the police getting beat up don't make the decisions, ultimately. They don't make the decision to attack. They don't make the decision to retreat. They don't make the decision to deploy. They don't make the decision to use rubber bullets. They don't make the decision to use live ammo. They don't make these decisions. The policemen and policewomen, apparently, don't make these decisions. People who make these decisions are politicians and police chiefs. And politicians and police chiefs at the higher levels of this police structure have an incentive to exacerbate issues so that they can get more funding, right? There's riots in America. Oh, well, I guess we need to fund the police more, right? That's all that's going to come out of this. If you expect for one moment that as a result of these riots, they're going to say, oh, police, you can't have guns anymore, and we're going to decrease the number of police in America. That's laughable. Of course, the number of police is going to increase. Of course, the funding is going to increase. They're all going to have tanks. They're going to all look more like SWAT teams. They're going to get more heavy armor and bulletproof vests. And all of that is money. And the more money you have, the more graft you have, and the more corruption you have, the more power you have, right? So on this is a libertarian point, but there's a fundamental incentive for the leadership of the police as an institution to want riots to happen, to let the riots happen. What do they care? It's not their target getting burned down. It's not their small business. Let the riots go on, because then the people will turn to us. The Republicans, this is the trap. Right? The Democrats are inflaming this radical religion of racial resentment. And then the Republicans are saying, excellent, great, we love it. Because then we're going to get more funding for the military. Then we're going to get more funding for the police. And we'll get votes. We're not going to stop the riot. No, we're going to let it go as hot and as hard as possible. I mean, again, this is getting worse. As much as you can criticize George H.W. Bush, he ended the riots. Trump isn't ending the riots. Trump is buying into the narrative. Trump is saying he's playing both sides, right? On the one, in the worst way, because on the one hand, he's saying, oh, George Floyd, he is a martyr, he is sacred. And look, I don't hate George Floyd, even though he did go into a woman's house and stick a gun to her head, and he was a thief, and he had a long criminal record. He's not something I wouldn't want to hang out with him. I don't even like him, to be honest. But what was done to him was pretty disgusting and brutal. And I don't think he deserved it. I think he deserved probably to be in jail, given his criminal history. But I don't think he deserved to be killed in that way. The autopsy has come out saying that he had a drug-induced heart attack of sorts. But still, I mean, clearly 9 minutes, I mean, it's just not excusable. Probably the stress, the psychological stress of having a knee on your neck for 9 minutes probably was a contributing factor to his drug-induced heart attack or whatever. I don't want to debate the details. I want to debate the big narratives. The Trump tweets where on the one hand he sacralizes George Floyd and thus in the most obsequious manner pays into the religion of racial resentment that is the cause behind these riots. Not black bodies, not black criminality, not black violence. It's a religious fanaticism that's enabling these riots. He pays into that. And then on the other hand, he says, when the looting starts, the shooting starts, right? So not only is he encouraging people to buy into this religion, but he is also giving ammo to the left of saying, and I'm the big demon, right? There's the angel, the saint, the Jesus Christ martyr, that's George Floyd, and I'm the demon, I'm the Satan, I'm the white supremacist, right? So he's playing both sides. I mean, whether he's conscious of it or not, I guess we'll never know. I mean, some people want to look at him as a big buffoon, as an idiot. Some people want to look at him as a cynical Machiavellian businessman, a reality TV show host who thinks that, you know, the riots are going to make the Democrats look bad, and that's going to help me win re-election. You know, there are a lot of theories about Trump. Maybe he's just genuinely stupid and he doesn't know what he's doing. But his actions and the actions of people who follow him and the conservatives who on the one hand say this religion of racial resentment is awesome and I stand behind it 100% morally, but I also stand behind creating a police state where we give more power to the cops, right? So with the Democrats, you get the increased size of the state under Obama and militarization of the police in Guantanamo Bay, but they pretend they're not for the military-industrial complex. Obama, this is like a Jimmy Dore take, but it's true. Obama will increase the scope of the military. He'll get involved in Libya. He'll fund all these color revolutions in Ukraine and Egypt. He'll, basically do all the same imperialist stuff, but he'll pretend to be sympathetic to the Palestinians. He'll pretend to kind of be a thorn in the side of Israel. He'll pretend to be against police brutality, right? All the while the police are becoming more militarized. All the while the military is expanding, right? But he'll pretend, Democrats will pretend that they're not for a radical, authoritarian police state, global American police state. They'll pretend, but then they'll fan the flames of this racial religion, this religion of racial resentment, and all the associated victimary ideologies, gay rights, and so on. So they'll do that part of it. The Republicans will pretend, oh, we want nothing to do with racial resentment. At the same time, they buy into Martin Luther King, right? But they'll pretend, oh, we're less. I mean, it's basically like you're dealing with people who are like, I'm a fanatical Christian and I believe we should follow the Bible exactly. And then you've got the guy who's like the moderate Christian of like, well, yeah, I believe in the Bible too, but we shouldn't be too strict about it. That's basically Democrats and Republicans. Democrats are like the true believers, and the Republicans are like, oh, I believe in it too. I think we should be a little balanced. And their balance is always more money for the military and more money for the cops so that they can occupy America and create a total tyrannical system where the chances of resistance are already pretty slim, but they are just going to continue dropping. When you have so much money and infrastructure thrown into these people. I mean, again, when we look at the videos of cops being beat up by protesters, that is intentional. And black people didn't orchestrate it. Just a reminder, black people didn't cause any of this. When cops are pulled to the ground and beaten by protesters, that is a choice of the police commissioners and the mayors and the governors, all the way to the top with Trump. That is a choice made by the decision makers. Cops do not need to be in that situation. If you wanted to stop the riots as quickly and as effectively as possible, you would not put cops out into that situation. You would just not put them out in that situation. Logistically, it's just not something you would do. You would put them in that vulnerable position of here you have a cop and they're outnumbered and they're surrounded and they're being beaten up. That would never happen. The only reason you would put them in that position is to inflame this religious fanaticism so that you can increase the police state on the one hand and also increase the fanaticism on the other hand. But if you just wanted to stop the whole process, you would have guys with guns, and they would say, "Hey, there's a curfew." By the way, we have a little bit of a health situation going on. I don't want to say the word, but we have a health situation. So maybe you're supposed to be inside, right? Remember that? Remember when we were all pretending there was a health situation? We were supposed to be inside. Remember that? Well, hey, you should really be inside. And now, if we see you outside, we're going to shoot you. Again, not something that's nice and not something... Again, I think if it had happened in Minneapolis, we wouldn't even be talking about it. If they shut it down day one in Minneapolis, we would not be having this conversation. But if you have well-armed people and you enforce a curfew and you just say, you have to stay inside, sorry, no protests, no rioting, it's over, we wouldn't be talking about this. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I don't want to get sucked into that anymore. I don't want to say, well, gosh, if we only gave complete dictatorial power to the police, then all of our problems would be solved, because it wouldn't address this underlying religious problem. Fundamentally, we wouldn't need the police to be on the streets. We wouldn't be dealing with this problem if it wasn't for this religious fanaticism. We just wouldn't be dealing with it. So what's the conclusion? What's the alternative? Is there a way out of this? The only way out of this is not through giving power to the police, as all of these Republicans are arguing. Blue lives matter. I support the police. We got to go out there with crossbows and support the police. All these people who are advocating for that, they're never addressing the fundamental religious problem that we have in this country. They're never addressing it. It's not going to be addressed by Democrats because they're fueling it. It's not going to be addressed by Republicans because all they're doing is saying, oh, well, you're religious, well, I have guns. That's not changing the religious landscape. So how would you change the religious landscape? There's basically a top-down and a bottom-up way. I don't know how the top-down way is going to work, because if you're rich, this religious movement is awesome. It's creating a bunch of broken windows. If you know anything about Keynesian economics, it's going to generate a lot of economic activity. With all these burning buildings right now, construction industry is going to do great. Okay, so if you're rich, you're having a fantastic time right now. If you're in the media, you're having a fantastic time. Everyone's glued to their media right now. Media's having a great time. If you're a police commissioner or chief of police, or you're part of the military, you're having a great time right now. Because look, we're going to get more funding. We're going to get more tools and toys and tricks to use against the population to suppress them. Right? So in every case, whenever I look at media, military, money power, they all seem to have an incentive to keep this train going. I don't see it stopping from the top down. From the bottom up, it would have to be religious. It wouldn't be guys with guns. It would have to be religious organizations that say, this religion that's being promoted in the mainstream is leading us to a really bad place. It's the monopolization of power by the top. Everyone else is getting screwed. We're turning into a third world country. The people on the top are laughing all the way to the bank. They love it. But it's really bad. It would have to be a religious movement. Now, in some cases, it might describe itself as a political movement, which is the same that communism did. I would describe communism as a religious movement. Right? And so that's something we have to keep in mind, that political movements in many cases really are religious movements that are using this terminology of secularism. In my mind, atheism doesn't exist. Right? When you understand that a religion is just a mythology that binds people together, then we can use that as a broad category of social organization. We don't have to create a separate category for politics and secular atheism and all those things. It's all the same human psychology. It's thousands of years old. It's all the same. We don't have to create some new special category just because some Freemasons or whatever thought that they were unique and special and they wanted to create a new utopian French Revolution. We're going to have a new secular religion. So I don't buy into that terminology. I just don't think it's accurate. I don't think it's honest. But a lot of the religious movements that crop up probably are going to present themselves as secular political movements in terms of the sociology of the situation, the terminology actually being used. So I guess the other theory about it, other than a religious movement that starts on the ground of people who say, hey, the way things are going is not that great. We need to totally change our worldview. We need to stop being fanatic racial resenters, and we need to have a different God and a different demonology and a different mythology. The only other way I can see things changing course, that is, we're currently on a train and it's headed from where we've been to where we're going, and we know where that is. We know it's more racial resentment. We know it's more hate speech laws. We know it's more quote-unquote terrorists getting sent to Guantanamo Bay without any due process. We know it's more world policing. We know it's rich getting richer. We know it's monopolization of power. We know where we're going. And the question is there any way that could change besides what I've already outlined, a religious movement, sometimes disguising itself as a political movement? Is there anything else that could change it? And that is this Stalinist option I've talked about, where you essentially have a dictator. And at first, the dictator is a member of the party, right? Stalin was a member of the Communist Party, and the Communist Party stood for abortion and divorce and gay rights and all those things back in the 20th century. I mean, they were very progressive. But Stalin comes along and he says, during World War II, he says, you know what, all of these policies are really not very helpful to me because I'm a dictator and I'm trying to keep society together and I'm trying to conquer Eastern Europe. And all of these religious components of communism, the feminism, the liberation, the sexual liberation, all these components of communism, Stalin said, they're not very helpful to me. And actually, a traditional imperial culture seems to be better for my purposes. So if you have a dictatorship in America, we could conceive of a position, we could conceive of a character who's part of the Democrat Party, maybe a Michael Bloomberg, maybe a Joe Biden, maybe someone a bit younger, maybe one of the Kennedys. Who knows who it's going to be, but it's going to be someone who's part of the party ideology. It's not going to be a right-wing extremist. Napoleon wasn't a monarchist, and Stalin was not a monarchist. Napoleon was on the side of the revolution. He fought with the revolutionary forces. Stalin was part of the Communist Party. So it's going to be someone from within this religion of racial resentment. It's going to be someone who's a Democrat, someone like a Michael Bloomberg, someone like a Biden, but they're going to be younger. It could be someone like an Obama, right? But it's going to be someone who comes from within the party who, because of extreme circumstances, whether it's a civil war, breakdown of the Constitution, suspension of whatever, national crisis, national emergency, they're going to consolidate power. They're going to suspend the Congress. Politics, as usual, is going to cease to be. It's going to be a bureaucracy, centrally controlled. The military is going to be consolidated not in civilian control, but under dictatorial control. Spangler describes this as Caesarism. And so everything's going to be consolidated around this one person, and this one person's going to look at this ideology of racial resentment that they themselves came out of in the same way that Stalin came out of communism and Napoleon came out of the French Revolution. They're going to look at it and say, this goes too far. And this isn't helping me. This is just causing a bunch of chaos, which is useful if you're a banker, which is useful if you're a CNN anchor, which is useful if you're a police commissioner or police chief or whatever, or a military general. Chaos is wonderful because it's a Keynesian broken window for you to make more money, and the libertarian critique, the state is growing in power and the bureaucracy and the perverse incentives and so on and so forth. But if you're a dictator, then all that stuff seems kind of counterproductive to your ends, which are keeping power, monopolizing power, not as a class of people, not as the banker class or the media class or the military class, but as an individual. Essentially, all the incentives that exist in a monarchy are very similar to those that exist for a dictator. So if we do have a dictator, you're going to see a change in the incentive structures. And if you have those changes in incentive structures, then possibly in the same way that Napoleon changed the ideology of the French Revolution to something that was in many ways much more conservative, in the way that Stalin changed the Soviet Union for something that was socially radical to something that was more conservative than America, Western Europe. There was no sexual revolution in the 1960s in the Soviet Union. They didn't have gay pride parades. They didn't have LSD and marijuana. They didn't even have rock and roll and bell-bottom jeans. Okay, all those things were banned. And when we talk about, the Soviet Union, everyone hated it and it fell, and that itself is a myth. I don't believe people are going to come out, don't you think people are going to get sick of this and just have a rebellion? And they'll point to the Soviet Union as an example. The Soviet Union didn't fall. The Soviet Union was attacked from the inside. When you look at the 1980s, when you look at the oligarchs, the semi-Bankushina, the merchant class that took over Russia following that created the fall of the Soviet Union. When you look at Gorbachev, when you look at all these people, they destroyed the Soviet Union by choice from the inside. America, of course, was very influential, but there were also classes within the Soviet Union that wanted to see it fall. And so that was the leadership class of the Soviet Union itself desiring for the destruction of the Soviet system. That wasn't the people themselves rising up. The people are never going to rise up. When they do rise up, they rise up in a way that benefits the mainstream. What we're experiencing now is very similar to Mao's Cultural Revolution. Mao said, I want to consolidate power around myself, and the society still has too much of old China. It has too much of Taoism, too much Confucianism. We need to destroy that. We need to destroy that and have a cultural revolution. And so people were beaten, and people were shamed, and people were doxxed, and people lost their jobs, and there was mass violence. And Mao was laughing. He was laughing as the cities were on fire. It's very similar to what we're going through right now, where the media and the government, including Trump and all these people, and the military and the cops, at least the leadership of the cops, the leadership of the police, not the police themselves, of course, they don't make decisions, but the people who lead the police and the politicians who make the decisions are creating a situation that is very similar to a cultural revolution. People get doxxed, and people get their jobs lost, and there's mass violence, and there's destruction of temples, right? Destruction of statues, destruction of history. So we're seeing all the very same things, and it doesn't mean a revolution. It doesn't mean that the system's going to be undermined. What it means is the system is rooting out those parts of itself that are anachronistic, and it's purifying itself. So no, the people are not going to revolt. We're not going to have a revolution. We're either going to have a religious movement that can counter the mainstream religion, or we're going to have a dictator who acts as a Napoleon or a Stalin, who manages to consolidate things and cut out some of the radicalism and the fanaticism and create a more manageable system. So I think that's enough for today. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.